70,000 feet, 13.2 miles straight up. At that altitude in 1956, no Soviet interceptor could reach you, no missile could touch you, and no radar could track you reliably. Or so we calculated. The numbers said impossible. The wreckage 4 years later said otherwise. This was the gamble behind America's most audacious intelligence operation. That altitude alone could make you untouchable in the nuclear age. By the early 1950s, existing reconnaissance aircraft operated below 45,000 feet, well within reach of Soviet MiG-17 interceptors, with a service ceiling of 54,000 feet, and S-25 Berkut surface-to-air missile systems, effective up to 55,000 feet. Any penetration of Soviet airspace meant near-certain interception and diplomatic catastrophe. Intelligence requirements demanded coverage of Soviet ICBM development sites and nuclear facilities, but no platform could reach them without suicidal risk. Kelly Johnson's solution was radical: strip everything non-essential and build a powered glider that could sustain flight where the air itself barely existed. The U-2 featured an 80-foot wingspan on an airframe weighing just 14,250 pounds empty. This created a glider-like lift-to-drag ratio of 25:1. The massive wing area of 600 square feet generated sufficient lift in air density, just 3% of sea level pressure. At 70,000 feet, atmospheric pressure measured only 1.1 pounds per square inch, requiring the Pratt & Whitney J57 engine to operate at the very limits of physics. The engine told the whole story of the compromise. Producing 11,200 pounds of thrust at sea level, it could manage only about 2,200 pounds at operational altitude. This placed the aircraft in what pilots called the coffin corner, where stall speed and maximum speed converged within just 10 knots. Any deviation risked loss of control. For most of the time on a typical mission, the U-2 was flying less than 5 knots above stall speed. The U-2 carried no pressurization, no ejection seat initially, and no defensive systems. Every pound mattered when you were trying to fly in an environment that could barely support flight. Soviet radar operators noticed the intrusions almost immediately. Beginning in July 1956, S-band air defense stations detected intermittent high-altitude returns, but triangulation proved inconsistent. Chief designer Sergei Beria's team analyzed radar logs and concluded the intruder operated between 65,000 and 70,000 feet based on signal propagation delays and Doppler shifts. They measured the aircraft's speed at approximately 410 knots, slower than expected for a jet, suggesting extreme altitude optimization rather than speed. The detection range became a critical factor. Soviet radars could reliably track the U-2 only within 150 miles due to horizon limitations and the aircraft's radar cross-section of 3 to 5 square meters. But detection wasn't the same as engagement. Soviet Air Defense Command required 4 to 6 hours to coordinate fighter and missile responses, and the U-2 could traverse over 2,000 miles in that window. As soon as July 1956, the aircraft began running reconnaissance flights over Soviet and Allied territories from bases in West Germany and Turkey. Mission planners laid out film strips showing parked Soviet bombers in crisp detail, proving both the camera's 2.5-foot resolution from an altitude of 60,000 feet and Soviet inability to intercept at altitude. But the Soviets were learning. Within 6 months of confirmed U-2 detections, the Soviet Air Defense Forces prioritized S-75 Dvina upgrades. Engineers extended missile burnout altitude from 60,000 to over 70,000 feet by optimizing fuel grain composition and reducing warhead weight from 195 kilograms to 150 kilograms, trading explosive yield for altitude reach. They calculated that by firing a salvo of 3 missiles in a triangulated pattern and detonating warheads at optimal 200-meter separation, shrapnel dispersion could compensate for guidance limitations. The myth of invulnerability was always exactly that. CIA assessments calculated a 30% probability of successful Soviet missile engagement if they developed dedicated high-altitude missiles and employed salvo tactics. Internal memos show Richard Bissell and President Eisenhower understood vulnerability increased with each overflight as Soviet systems improved. The difference between CIA estimates and Soviet capabilities stemmed from limited intelligence penetration of Soviet air defense programs and over-reliance on captured German radar technology as a baseline. By 1959, the Soviets had deployed upgraded batteries along likely U-2 corridors, creating overlapping engagement zones. Test firings at Kapustin Yar achieved maximum intercept altitudes of 68,000 feet, just below the U-2's operational ceiling. The margin for error was shrinking with each month. The unit cost of $3.5 million per aircraft in 1956 meant every loss carried strategic implications beyond the human cost. The program required aircraft for global coverage, and pilot endurance limited practical missions to 8 to 10 hours despite the aircraft's fuel capacity for much longer flights. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, flying a U-2 conducting photographic aerial reconnaissance inside Soviet territory when it was hit by a surface-to-air missile. Powers parachuted to the ground and was captured. His U-2 was shot down near Kosulino, Ural region, by the first of 3 S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missiles fired by a battery commanded by Mikhail Voronov. One of the Soviet MiG-19 fighters pursuing Powers was also destroyed in the missile salvo, and the pilot, Sergei Safronov, was killed. The shoot-down proved that the envelope of safety had closed. The Soviets had not only developed the technical capability to engage targets at extreme altitude, but had also demonstrated the operational coordination to employ these systems effectively. The era of high-altitude invulnerability had ended not with a gradual erosion of capability, but with a single, decisive engagement that changed the strategic calculus overnight. By April 1960, Eisenhower faced a choice: authorize one final deep penetration mission to photograph suspected ICBM sites before the Paris summit, or accept a months-long intelligence blackout. The photos were essential for understanding Soviet strategic capabilities. The diplomatic risk seemed manageable. What wasn't calculable was how much Soviet missile technology had improved, and whether 13.2 miles of altitude still meant anything at all. May 1, 1960. Article 360 climbs through 66,000 feet over Sverdlovsk at 6:53 local time. Below, 3 S-75 missile batteries track the radar return. The warhead that explodes 50 meters behind Powers' tail carries 195 kilograms of fragmentation rods. He survives 13 minutes of freefall. The aircraft doesn't. Two numbers explain why: 200 meters horizontal spread and 3-second proximity fuse delay. The Soviets didn't outclimb the U-2, they outcalculated it. This was the moment when altitude protection died, and geometry became the new mathematics of survival. Despite S-75 improvements, no single missile could reliably reach a maneuvering target at 70,000 feet with sufficient warhead proximity for a kill. The missile's rocket motor burned out at approximately 68,000 to 72,000 feet, leaving minimal kinetic energy for terminal guidance corrections. Time of flight from launch to intercept at extreme altitude exceeded 90 seconds, during which the target traveled over 10 miles. Radio command guidance required continuous radar lock throughout the missile's flight. Soviet doctrine assumed just a 10 to 15% probability of kill per missile against high-altitude targets. A single missile was a gamble. 3 missiles, launched in timed sequence with overlapping warhead detonation zones, changed the mathematics entirely. Major Mikhail Voronov's battery executed a 3-missile salvo with staggered launch intervals of 7 seconds, calculated to place warheads in a triangulated pattern 200 meters apart horizontally at the predicted intercept point. The first missile provided updated tracking data via radio telemetry. The second and third adjusted trajectories mid-flight based on the target's actual position. Each missile carried a proximity fuse set to detonate at 50 meters if radar return indicated target proximity, or automatically at 150 meters if no lock achieved. At 6:53 and 40 seconds local time, the third missile's warhead detonated approximately 50 meters behind Article 360's tail section at an altitude calculated between 68,000 and 70,000 feet. The 195-kilogram warhead dispersed steel fragmentation rods at 2,000 meters per second, shredding the U-2's tail control surfaces and severing hydraulic lines. The U-2's lightweight construction told the story of the kill. Optimized for altitude, not survivability, structural members had minimal redundancy. Longerons measured just 1.2 millimeters thick. A single rod penetration of the tail spar caused cascading aerodynamic failure. Powers lost pitch control within 3 seconds. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent. The salvo tactic succeeded because it created a lethal volume rather than relying on a single intercept point, compensating for guidance system limitations with geometry. Major Voronov's post-engagement report documented radar lock maintained for 78 seconds during the engagement sequence, with intermittent tracking dropouts of 2 to 3 seconds due to ground clutter. His battery's fan-song radar operated at 3.0 GHz with a peak power output of 600 kilowatts, enabling slant-range tracking to 85 miles. Soviet engineers later examined Article 360's wreckage at Tushino airfield, recovering the camera system intact and analyzing film from the developed exposure. The metallurgists measured fragmentation rod penetration depths in aluminum wing spars, 4 to 7 centimeters, confirming warhead effectiveness. They documented the U-2's structural design philosophy and calculated that a conventional fighter airframe would have likely survived the same fragmentation pattern due to redundant spars and thicker skin. A conventional bomber's aluminum skin measured 3 to 5 millimeters thick. The U-2's measured 1.2 millimeters. At 6:53 hours Sverdlovsk time, Powers felt the aircraft shudder and heard a dull thump. The instrument panel showed no fire warning, but the stick went dead in his hand. No response to pitch or roll inputs. Within seconds, the nose pitched down and the aircraft entered an inverted spin. G-forces pinned him against the canopy. At 15,000 feet, after deliberately free-falling to avoid frostbite and hypoxia, he deployed his parachute and drifted toward a plowed field outside Kasulino village. The dispute over Powers' altitude reflects measurement limitations, not operational failure. Powers' altimeter read approximately 66,000 feet at weapon impact, but altimeter lag during rapid descent and differences in pressure calibration create discrepancies. Soviet radar data placed intercept between 70,000 and 72,000 feet. CIA post-mission analysis concluded actual altitude was likely 68,000 to 70 though. Use and feet. The difference stemmed from standard atmosphere definitions between Soviet and U.S. systems. Powers never activated the aircraft's self-destruct charge, later criticized as intelligence compromise. The demolition charge required a 70-second arming sequence and was positioned directly behind the pilot's seat, with blast radius estimated at 10 feet. Powers later testified that attempting activation during an inverted spin at high speed risked premature detonation that would have killed him before ejection. CIA operational doctrine prioritized pilot survival over complete aircraft destruction in uncontrolled situations. Within hours of the shootdown, Soviet air defense units across the USSR received updated engagement protocols. Salvos of 3 missiles became standard for high-altitude targets. Fan-song radars received calibration updates to improve tracking continuity at extreme elevation angles. The wreckage analysis accelerated Soviet understanding of Western reconnaissance technology, particularly the camera's optical design and film chemistry. Simultaneously, the diplomatic aftermath forced immediate suspension of all U-2 overflights of Soviet territory. Eisenhower initially authorized a cover story claiming a weather research aircraft strayed off course, but the Soviets' public display of wreckage, film, and Powers himself at a May 7 press conference demolished deniability. The U-2 program shifted focus to periphery missions, flying along borders rather than deep penetration, reducing intelligence collection effectiveness by an estimated 60%. But the strategic impact reached beyond reconnaissance. The shootdown validated Soviet air defense capabilities and demonstrated that technological superiority could be overcome through tactical innovation. More critically, it proved that the nuclear age's reconnaissance requirements demanded a platform immune to surface-to-air missiles entirely. 13 days after the shootdown, Powers sat in Lubyanka prison answering KGB interrogators' questions about flight routes, camera settings, and operational procedures. His answers would be paraded at a show trial, but the strategic damage was already complete. The era of manned high-altitude reconnaissance over hostile territory had ended with 50 meters of fragmentation dispersal and the inexorable mathematics of multiple missile salvos. 173 miles up, 33 times higher than Powers flew. At that altitude, no missile exists, no treaty applies, and no pilot risks capture. The first successful Corona satellite, launched August 18, 1960, 3.5 months after the U-2 shootdown, photographed 1.6 million square miles of Soviet territory in a single mission. Powers' film canister covered 3,800 square miles, 2 platforms, 1 revolution. How do you escape the envelope of destruction entirely? The altitude race ended because altitude itself became obsolete. After May 1, 1960, the U-2 program faced insurmountable constraints: diplomatic prohibition on Soviet overflight, improved Soviet air defenses now proven effective, presidential directive limiting missions to peripheral reconnaissance. Peripheral flights along Soviet borders provided oblique-angle photography of limited value. Resolution degraded to 10 to 15 feet from standoff distances, and critical interior targets remained inaccessible. The intelligence community needed continuous, comprehensive coverage of Soviet strategic forces to assess the missile gap. No manned aircraft could provide this without unacceptable risk. The only escape was to leave the atmosphere entirely. Corona achieved what aircraft couldn't by operating in low Earth orbit at 173 miles altitude, far beyond the reach of any surface-to-air missile or interceptor. Each satellite followed a sun-synchronous polar orbit, passing over Soviet territory multiple times per day as the Earth rotated beneath it. The camera system used a panoramic rotating lens that scanned a 120-degree arc perpendicular to the flight path, capturing a ground swath 120 miles wide on 70mm film. After 7 to 10 days in orbit, the satellite ejected a film return capsule that deployed a parachute and was snagged midair by a C-119 flying boxcar aircraft over the Pacific. The key technical breakthrough was the panoramic camera lens design, which maintained 42-foot ground resolution across the entire swath. Inferior to the U-2's 2.5-foot resolution, but acceptable for strategic target identification. Equally critical was the Thor-Agena launch vehicle, which reliably placed 850-pound payloads into orbit and enabled capsule recovery. By moving reconnaissance beyond the atmosphere, Corona eliminated the engagement envelope of every air defense system in existence. No international law prohibited satellite overflight. The USSR's own Sputnik launch in 1957 had established the precedent of orbital freedom. Soviet radar networks tracked Corona satellites from the first successful mission, Discover 14, on August 18, 1960. Orbital parameters were immediately calculated from radio telemetry and radar observations. Soviet Space Forces analysts recognized the reconnaissance mission profile within days. Chief designer Sergei Korolev briefed the Politburo that Soviet radar could detect and track the satellites, but had no capability to intercept them. Anti-satellite weapons were in early development, but would not be operational until 1963. Soviet countermeasures initially focused on camouflage and concealment. Mobile ICBM launchers remained under cover during known satellite overflights. Fixed installations received roof camouflage upgrades. The exact resolution capabilities remained unknown to Soviet planners until 1965, creating paranoia about detection and leading to massive expenditures on concealment infrastructure. On August 19, 1960, at 14:23 hours UTC, Discover 14's film capsule separated from the Agena stage over the Bering Sea. 47 minutes later, at an altitude of 8,500 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Captain Harold Mitchell of the 6,593rd Test Squadron, flying a C-119, snagged the capsule's parachute with his aircraft's trapeze recovery system on the first pass. The capsule contained the first overhead photographs of Soviet territory taken from space, covering portions of Kamchatka Peninsula. Within 36 hours, CIA photo interpreters Ha.D. developed, scanned, and analyzed the imagery. Corona didn't immediately replace the U-2 after Powers' shootdown. Corona didn't achieve operational reliability until 1961, and resolution limitations meant U-2 peripheral missions continued throughout the 1960s for tactical intelligence requiring higher detail. The programs were complementary, not replacements. U-2 missions along Soviet borders provided 2.5-foot resolution of border installations, while Corona covered strategic targets in the interior at 42-foot resolution. The first 13 Corona missions failed before achieving success. Early failures included launch vehicle malfunctions, camera failures, and capsule recovery misses. Corona development began in 1958, 2 years before Power's shootdown, driven by recognition that U-2 overflights were inherently risky and politically unsustainable. The shootdown validated this assessment and increased funding priority, but didn't initiate the program. Soviet responses to Corona focused on denial and deception rather than direct countermeasures. Military installations received extensive camouflage upgrades. Mobile ICBM systems prioritized concealment and rapid deployment to complicate satellite tracking. The Soviet anti-satellite program, initiated in 1960, achieved first successful intercept in 1963, but operational constraints limited effectiveness. By 1965, the U.S. operated multiple Corona satellites simultaneously, ensuring continuous coverage even if one was destroyed. The strategic implication was profound. Space became the dominant reconnaissance domain, driving decades of orbital competition and establishing the principle that information dominance depended on platforms beyond atmospheric limits. Corona provided photographic coverage totaling approximately 750 million square miles of the Earth's surface over its operational lifetime. Within 6 months of Discoverer 14, national intelligence estimates were completely revised. Before Corona, estimates predicted that the Soviets would have 140 to 200 ICBMs deployed by 1961. 1 month after Discoverer 14, that estimate was refined to just 10 to 25. The missile gap was revealed to be largely fictional. Francis Gary Powers returned to the United States in February 1962, exchanged for Soviet KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel in a carefully choreographed spy swap on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. By then, multiple Corona missions had photographed the entire Soviet Union. The space race was just beginning, and the intelligence war had moved to a battlefield where neither pilots nor missiles mattered. Only orbits, cameras, and the political will to use them. August 19, 1960. Hall of Columns, Moscow. Francis Gary Powers sits in a wooden defendant's cage answering questions over 10 hours. Outside, KGB technicians have reconstructed 90% of Article 360's airframe from wreckage collected across a 30-mile radius. The trial isn't about justice. It's about exposure. Every technical detail becomes public testimony. 2 numbers define the damage. 61 days of interrogation and 0 plausible deniability remaining. How do you weaponize a captured pilot when the wreckage tells the story better than any confession? This was the moment when intelligence gathering became theater and technical evidence replaced coercion as the ultimate extraction method. The Eisenhower administration's initial cover story collapsed within 72 hours when Khrushchev revealed Powers was alive and the wreckage intact. No precedent existed for handling the public exposure of a classified reconnaissance program during peacetime. Traditional espionage doctrine assumed captured agents would be quietly exchanged or remain silent under interrogation. The CIA had no protocol for managing a show trial where technical systems, operational procedures, and strategic intent would be dissected publicly. Every detail Powers revealed would inform Soviet countermeasures and compromise future intelligence operations. The constraint was total, complete operational exposure with no diplomatic mechanism to contain it. The Soviet strategy succeeded not through coercion, but through meticulous technical reconstruction that made denial futile. KGB forensic teams collected wreckage fragments across the crash site, documenting serial numbers, camera components, navigation equipment, and survival gear. Crucially, they recovered the camera system's film magazine with exposed but undeveloped film. Laboratory analysis revealed previous flight routes over Soviet strategic sites, that conclusively proved espionage intent. During 61 days of interrogation, Powers provided basic operational details, altitude profiles, mission durations, CIA organizational structure, but withheld cryptographic procedures and names of foreign intelligence contacts. The Soviets didn't need aggressive interrogation. The physical evidence and Powers' partial cooperation provided sufficient material for a propaganda victory. At trial, prosecutors displayed wreckage, cameras, maps marked with previous routes, and Powers' survival kit containing 7,500 rubles in gold coins. The public testimony, broadcast domestically and covered internationally, served multiple Soviet objectives: demonstrate technical capability to defeat advanced Western systems, expose American espionage as violating international law, and undermine Eisenhower's credibility weeks before the Paris summit. The breakthrough was psychological warfare executed through judicial theater, where technical evidence replaced torture as the primary extraction method. KGB technical intelligence officers measured the camera's focal length at 36 inches, calculated ground resolution at 2.5 feet from 70,000 feet, and analyzed film chemistry to understand American photographic technology capabilities. They documented Powers' partial pressure suit specifications, including emergency oxygen system design that revealed operational altitude parameters. Soviet aerospace engineers examined the U-2's titanium construction in the wing root fairings, a manufacturing technique Soviet industry had struggled to replicate at scale. The interrogation transcripts provided CIA organizational insights. Powers described the operational chain from Bissell through detachment B commanders to individual pilots, confirming Soviet suspicions about CIA's direct operational control raw. Than Air Force management. Most valuable to Soviet strategic planners was the timeline data. Powers confirmed that overflights began in 1956, flew approximately twice monthly, and covered specific facilities that the Soviets had believed were undetected. This prompted immediate reviews of security at nuclear facilities, ICBM development sites, and bomber bases. On August 19, 1960, at 900 hours Moscow time, Powers entered the Hall of Columns escorted by 2 guards. His defense attorney, Mikhail Voronov, had met him twice, insufficient preparation by any standard, but the trial's outcome had been predetermined. During a recess, Western journalists observed Soviet citizens filing past a display table holding wreckage fragments, the camera weighing 450 pounds, and Powers' survival kit spread across felt-covered boards. That evening, Soviet television broadcast excerpts showing Powers describing CIA recruitment, training, and mission protocols, damaging testimony that U.S. intelligence agencies couldn't refute because accurate denials would require revealing operational details. 2 myths lingered and needed sorting. First, that Powers broke under interrogation. CIA debriefings after his 1962 release concluded Powers revealed minimal operationally significant information beyond what physical evidence already proved. He disclosed organizational structure and mission profiles, but protected cryptographic systems, agent identities, and technical capabilities of surveillance equipment beyond what the Soviets had physically recovered. The perception of betrayal stemmed partly from public unfamiliarity with espionage realities, and partly from CIA's institutional interest in deflecting blame for the mission's political fallout. Second, that the Soviets tortured Powers to extract testimony. Medical examinations after his release showed no evidence of physical abuse. Soviet interrogation strategy relied on psychological pressure, isolation, repetitive questioning, implicit threats to family, and leveraged the overwhelming physical evidence that made denial pointless. The KGB calculated that visible mistreatment would undermine the trial's propaganda value with international audiences. The disputed numbers tell their own story. Soviet prosecutors claimed 23 previous flight routes were identified based on film analysis and Powers' testimony. CIA historical accounts suggest 15 to 18 routes were accurately described. The discrepancy reflects Soviet inflation and classification of peripheral missions. The exact footage of exposed film recovered, claimed at 200 feet by Soviet sources, might have been partially fogged by light exposure according to CIA debriefings. Exact footage and image quality remain classified. The trial's international broadcast forced NATO allies to reassess intelligence sharing arrangements with the United States. British intelligence officials privately questioned CIA risk assessment procedures, noting that the Paris summit collapse damaged Western unity at a critical moment. Within the CIA, the incident triggered creation of new protocols for plausible deniability operations, leading to greater compartmentalization and reduced presidential direct authorization for tactical missions. The U-2 program shifted entirely to peripheral reconnaissance and friendly territory operations. Deep penetration missions over Soviet airspace never resumed. Most significantly, the exposure accelerated a fundamental shift in American intelligence architecture. On August 31, 1961, President Kennedy directed that management of the Corona satellite program and other reconnaissance satellites be transferred to the newly formed National Reconnaissance Office. The first successful Corona mission had launched on August 18, 1960, just 3.5 months after Powers' shootdown. That single mission returned 3,000 feet of film, imaging 1.65 million square miles of Soviet territory. More photographic coverage than the entire U-2 program had achieved up to that point. Within months, CIA photo interpreters had dispelled both the missile gap and the bomber gap, finding that Soviets were significantly behind the United States in development of workable ICBMs. Corona satellites operated at altitudes where no missile could reach, no treaty applied, and no pilot risked capture. The program would run for 12 years and 145 missions, ultimately achieving ground resolution of 5 to 7 feet. The diplomatic cost of Powers' trial, cancellation of the Paris summit, and a year-long chill in U.S.-Soviet relations reinforced that high-value intelligence required platforms beyond diplomatic retaliation. Satellites operating in international space rather than aircraft violating sovereign airspace. On August 19, 1960, Powers received a 10-year sentence. On February 10, 1962, 1 year, 9 months, and 10 days after his capture, he walked across Berlin's Glienicke Bridge and exchanged places with Rudolf Abel, a Soviet KGB colonel. The sentence reflected Soviet calculation that a live exchange had more value than imprisonment. Powers' debriefing would take months, but the real questions weren't about what he'd revealed. They were about what the intelligence community should have learned before altitude stopped meaning safety, before exposure became inevitable, and before the courtroom itself became a weapon that could strip away every layer of operational secrecy built into a program that had flown with impunity for 4 years. 14 surface-to-air missiles, 1 hit, 8% probability of loss per mission. That was the CIA's estimate in 1958. The actual Soviet intercept probability by early 1960, 23%. The difference between those two numbers explained everything: why the mission was authorized, why it failed, and why satellites became inevitable. Risk assessment isn't about courage, it's about mathematics. And in May 1960, the math changed permanently. This was the moment when intelligence gathering became an actuarial science, and survival probability replaced altitude supremacy as the governing metric. After Powers' shootdown, U.S. intelligence agencies faced an acute strategic intelligence gap. Peripheral U-2 missions along Soviet borders provided oblique-angle photography with 10 to 15-foot resolution, insufficient for detailed ICBM silo identification or submarine construction assessment. Corona satellites, while successful, had limitations. 7 to 10-day mission duration meant discontinuous coverage. 25-foot initial resolution couldn't match U-2 detail. Weather dependence meant cloud cover could obscure targets for weeks. Film return capsule ray recovery had a 40% success rate through 1961. Meanwhile, intelligence requirements intensified. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 demonstrated the need for rapid response reconnaissance. Soviet ICBM deployment accelerated. Chinese nuclear program required monitoring. The fundamental constraint was temporal. Satellites provided comprehensive area coverage but with delayed access, while aircraft could respond within hours but couldn't penetrate defended airspace. Rand Corporation analysts developed the first systematic reconnaissance platform vulnerability assessment, that quantified platform survivability against evolving Soviet air defenses. The methodology incorporated 4 variables: detection probability based on radar cross-section and operating frequency, engagement opportunity measured as time within surface-to-air missile range, hit probability determined by missile guidance accuracy at altitude, and mission duration representing total exposure time. For U-2 missions over Soviet territory, analysts calculated cumulative mission risk by multiplying individual engagement probabilities across the flight path. The model revealed that even with 92% single engagement survival probability, a 9-hour deep penetration mission crossing 15 SAM battery zones yielded only 33% mission survival probability, far worse than the 8% loss rate CIA had estimated using simpler calculations. The analysis exposed the flaw in previous risk assessments. They treated each overflight as an independent event, ignoring that Soviet air defense improvements accumulated over time. By contrast, satellites operating at 173 miles altitude faced zero engagement probability from existing weapons, making mission success rate-dependent only on technical reliability rather than adversary countermeasures. Soviet air defense forces conducted parallel assessments, documented in declassified reports. After May 1, 1960, Air Defense Command mandated readiness exercises simulating high-altitude intercepts every 72 hours. Analysts measured the improvement in engagement effectiveness. In 1956, the average time from radar detection to fighter scramble was 14 minutes. By 1960, this decreased to 6 minutes through procedural optimization and improved command and control systems. S-75 battery commanders received updated intercept doctrine emphasizing salvo tactics. 3 missiles became the standard instead of single launches. Most revealing was Soviet analysis of why 1950s-era assessments had underestimated their capabilities. American intelligence had relied on captured German V-2 engineers' assessments of Soviet technical capacity, assuming a 5 to 7 year technology lag. In reality, Soviet missile guidance systems had benefited from independent mathematical innovations, closing the gap to approximately 2 to 3 years by 1958. When Soviet archives opened partially in the 1990s, American analysts discovered that Soviet radar had tracked 97% of U-2 overflights in real time, not the 40% that CIA assessments assumed in 1958. This detection gap explained the probability miscalculation. RAND's cost-per-image analysis compared platforms systematically. U-2 missions cost approximately $800,000 per sortie with increasing attrition risk. Corona missions cost $3.5 million but photographed 1.6 million square miles, yielding a cost-per-square-mile advantage of 150 to 1. The breakthrough wasn't a new technology. It was a quantitative framework proving that orbital reconnaissance wasn't just safer. It was economically superior despite higher upfront costs. On December 12, 1962, at RAND's Santa Monica headquarters, analyst Bruno Augenstein presented a classified briefing to National Reconnaissance Office Director Joseph Charek. The conference room walls displayed charts comparing U-2, SR-71, and satellite options across 12 performance dimensions. Augenstein's summary slide showed one stark conclusion: survivability against projected 1965 Soviet air defenses showed aircraft at less than 20%, satellites above 99%. The decision followed within weeks. 2 myths needed sorting. First, that U-2 flights continued over Soviet territory after power shutdown until better technology became available. No U-2 overflights of Soviet airspace occurred after May 1, 1960. Presidential directive restricted operations to peripheral missions immediately. The program continued over other denied areas: China, Cuba, North Vietnam, where air defense capabilities were less developed, but Soviet territory remained off-limits. Second, that satellites replaced aircraft reconnaissance because they were superior in every dimension. Satellites offered superior survivability and area coverage, but initially lagged in resolution: 25 feet versus 2.5 feet, response time measured in days versus hours, and weather independence. The transition was driven by risk management, not by across-the-board technical superiority. Tactical reconnaissance continued to rely on aircraft throughout the Cold War for rapid response requirements. The risk quantification methodology developed for U-2 assessment became the template for all subsequent intelligence platform evaluations. When the SR-71 entered service in 1966, its Mach 3.2 speed and 85,000-foot ceiling were evaluated using the same probability models, leading to restricted employment over the most heavily defended targets despite superior performance. Soviet responses focused on accepting satellite reconnaissance as inevitable while developing anti-satellite capabilities. The first successful anti-satellite intercept in 1963 signaled a new phase of the space competition. The intelligence community's shift toward quantitative risk assessment influenced broader Cold War strategy. Arms control verification increasingly relied on national technical means. Code for satellites, explicitly permitted under treaties, establishing space reconnaissance as a stabilizing factor rather than a provocative one. By acknowledging mutual satellite surveillance, superpowers reduced uncertainty about each other's strategic forces. An ironic result of a program that began with secret overflights and ended with transparent orbita. Monitoring. The equations were settled. Satellites would dominate strategic reconnaissance for the rest of the Cold War and beyond. But one question lingered in classified Pentagon studies and congressional hearing rooms. What happened to the pilot who'd been on the wrong side of those probability calculations? Francis Gary Powers had survived the math. Now he had to survive the verdict of the country that sent him into that 33% survival corridor over Sverdlovsk. 65 years later, U-2 aircraft still fly reconnaissance missions from 70,000 feet, but they never again crossed into Soviet airspace. That boundary, invisible at 13 miles up, became more absolute than any border wall. The May 1, 1960 shoot-down killed one era of espionage and birthed another. Three numbers measure the transformation. 0 post-Powers Soviet penetrations, 145 Corona satellite missions over 12 years, and 200 miles. The altitude where international law never formed, where satellites still operate, where the only limit is technology, not treaties. How does a single shoot-down rewrite the rules of intelligence gathering for generations? This was the moment when the reconnaissance war moved from atmosphere to orbit, and vulnerability became the metric that mattered more than altitude. After Powers' return in February 1962, U.S. intelligence agencies faced a credibility crisis. Congressional hearings questioned CIA operational competence and presidential oversight of covert programs. NATO allies demanded consultation before risky operations that could trigger superpower confrontation. The reconnaissance gap persisted. Satellites improved, but couldn't yet provide the resolution or responsiveness required for tactical intelligence during crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The U-2 fleet continued flying, but where? Soviet airspace remained prohibited. The fundamental constraint was doctrinal: how to employ a capability whose original mission profile had been permanently invalidated. The solution emerged through three parallel developments that redefined the U-2's role. First, peripheral reconnaissance doctrine matured into a systematic capability. U-2s flew along borders using oblique-angle cameras and electronic intelligence systems to collect signals from deep within denied territory without airspace violation. This reduced political risk while maintaining intelligence value. Second, the U-2 became the crisis response platform for non-superpower targets where air defenses were less sophisticated. The aircraft's long endurance made it ideal for rapidly developing situations where satellite revisit times were inadequate. On October 14, 1962, Major Richard Haser's U-2 flight discovered Soviet missile sites in Cuba, proving that aircraft reconnaissance remained essential for crisis response despite satellite availability. Third, and most significantly, the U-2 evolved into a technology testbed for reconnaissance systems later deployed on satellites. The breakthrough wasn't reinventing the U-2's mission. It was accepting that strategic reconnaissance had bifurcated into two complementary domains: space for comprehensive, continuous, low-risk coverage, and aircraft for responsive, high-resolution, medium-risk tactical intelligence. Meanwhile, the Corona program revolutionized intelligence collection from orbit. After 13 failed missions, Corona mission XIV succeeded on August 18, 1960, just 3.5 months after Power's shootdown. That single mission returned more photographic coverage of the Soviet Union than all previous U-2 overflights combined. The first Corona images were grainy and of limited utility, but quality improved rapidly on succeeding missions. Within a few months, CIA photo interpreters had dispelled both the missile gap and the bomber gap. They found that Soviets were significantly behind the United States in development of a workable ICBM. In just a few weeks, Corona photography had eliminated the Soviet intelligence dilemma that had haunted the United States for a decade. The program ran for 12 years, completing 145 missions before the final capsule was recovered in May 1972. Soviet analysts tracked continued U-2 operations carefully, documenting every peripheral mission and assessing American intelligence collection priorities based on flight routes. When U-2s began flying crisis missions over Cuba in October 1962, Soviet military advisors in Cuba recommended against engaging them despite having surface-to-air missile capability. This restraint reflected strategic learning. The May 1960 shootdown had provided propaganda victory, but at the cost of accelerating American satellite development and hardening Western resolve. By the late 1960s, Soviet intelligence realized that American satellite reconnaissance posed a greater long-term challenge than aircraft. Soviet responses shifted toward camouflage, concealment, and deception rather than kinetic engagement. Analysis of declassified reports reveals Soviet intelligence officers viewed the U-2 incident as a watershed that ultimately disadvantaged the USSR. It accelerated American technological superiority in space-based reconnaissance, established legal precedents favoring satellite surveillance, and demonstrated that kinetic responses to intelligence collection could backfire strategically. On July 1, 1977, at CIA headquarters, Director Stansfield Turner presented Francis Gary Powers with the Distinguished Intelligence Cross, the CIA's highest honor, awarded 17 years after his capture. Powers had spent the intervening years as a helicopter pilot and aviation consultant. His reputation rehabilitated after multiple investigations concluded he'd behaved appropriately during capture and interrogation. Powers died on August 1, 1977, just 1 month later, when his traffic helicopter crashed in Los Angeles. The pilot who'd survived a 70,000-foot shootdown and 21 months of Soviet captivity died in a routine civilian accident at 500 feet. 3 myths needed sorting. First, that the U-2 program was discontinued after Powers' shootdown due to obsolescence. U-2 production continued, with modernized variants still flying in 2025. The aircraft was never obsolete. Its mission profile over Soviet territory became politically impossible, but the platform remained viable for other denied areas and specialized missions. Second, that satellites made aircraft reconnaissance unnecessary after 1960. Aircraft reconnaissance complemented satellites throughout the Cold War and beyond. Satellites excel at predictable, wide-area coverage. Aircraft excel at rapid response to emerging situations. Both capabilities remain essential. Third, that Powers' shootdown was inevitable because the U-2 was outmatched by Soviet technology. The shootdown resulted from cumulative Soviet improvements that closed the capability gap over 4 years, combined with operational risks compounding over missions. The failure was risk assessment, not technology. The U-2 incident's most profound legacy was establishing the legal and diplomatic framework for satellite reconnaissance that persists today. By making aircraft-based strategic reconnaissance untenable while intelligence requirements intensified, Powers' shootdown forced both superpowers to accept mutual satellite surveillance as a stabilizing alternative. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 explicitly permitted satellite reconnaissance as peaceful use of space. This mutual transparency contributed to arms control verification, particularly the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, which explicitly permitted national technical means of verification. The incident also accelerated the integration of technical intelligence into military doctrine. Before 1960, photo reconnaissance was primarily strategic, assessing adversary capabilities over months and years. After 1960, intelligence cycles compressed toward tactical support. This shift drove development of real-time reconnaissance systems, with each generation prioritizing responsiveness and survivability, lessons learned from Power's experience. On August 31, 1961, President Kennedy directed that management of the Corona program and other reconnaissance satellites be transferred to the newly formed National Reconnaissance Office. This centralized satellite intelligence organization consolidated programs that had been split between CIA and Air Force management. The shift represented institutional recognition that space-based reconnaissance was no longer experimental, it was the future. 70,000 feet, the number that defined an era, launched a technological revolution and proved that altitude alone offers no sanctuary. Power's mission lasted 9 hours, its consequences lasted 65 years and counting. The U-2 still flies, but the world it flies through was fundamentally changed by one missile, one pilot, and the decision to send him beyond the reach of safety, but not beyond the reach of consequence. The Cold War ended. The reconnaissance war never did. It just moved higher, faster, and into domains where the only question that matters isn't can they shoot you down, but can they even see you coming. The altitude race ended. The invisibility race began, and it's still running. The Cold War may have ended, but its secrets keep surfacing. If you want to dive deeper into the classified operations, hidden technologies, and covert missions that shaped our world, subscribe to Cold War Tales and hit that notification bell, because the next declassified story drops next week. Which Cold War mystery should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Soviet space programs, CIA operations in Berlin, the race for stealth technology, your curiosity drives our research. Join the conversation on our community tab, where we share newly declassified documents and behind-the-scenes research that didn't make it into the final cut. And if you found this story compelling, check out these videos, Gesture to End Screen Cards, where we uncover more hidden chapters of the intelligence war that never truly ended. Until next time, remember, the best secrets are the ones worth telling. Cold War Tales, because history is never just history.